Dear Sir, we write you at the urgent request of several of our Republican citizens. Ours is perhaps the most intensely pro-slavery county in the state. Many of the most active and influential Democrats are heartily in sympathy with the rebel states. They are maddened by the present attitude and activity of the federal government and would gladly seek their vengeance on such Republicans as are within their reach.
The letters started to arrive in the office of Illinois Governor Richard Yates shortly after the attack on Fort Sumter, which began the Civil War in April 1861.
We believe that our lives and property are in danger. We are mostly without arms. None of us are properly prepared for defense in such an emergency. We want rifles and revolvers. Is it within the policy of the state to supply exposed communities with the means of defense? If so, can we have any help? Truly yours, for American liberty, Parker Earl.
These letters were saying, there are Democrats marching in the woods down here. Please send troops.
Jennifer Weber is a professor of history at the United States Air Force Academy and author of the book, The Copperheads.
Very alarmed and alarming letters from the very, very beginning of the war about these people out there who disagreed with the war and were picking up arms in response to that against the federal government.
These letters from Republican citizens of Illinois, deathly afraid of their neighbors, speak volumes about the emerging threat of anti-government activity from Democrats in the Midwest who are against the war, and how that could play into the hands of the Confederacy. These Democrats, known as Copperheads, became a monumental challenge for the new administration of President Abraham Lincoln, and one that would only get worse as the war progressed. This is the Copperhead Conspiracy. I'm Dan Gettleman. In many respects, it's a minor miracle that the United States didn't devolve into a full civil war years before 1861. For decades, really since the first Constitutional Convention in 1787, America had been embroiled in arguments large and small pertaining to the institution of slavery. Especially as the country expanded westward, the issue of where slavery would be legal and where it would not consumed much of Congress's time and energy. Throughout the early 19th century, various efforts were attempted to thread the needle between the South's desire for more land to grow cotton and the North's increasing discomfort with slavery. There was the Missouri Compromise of 1820, the Compromise of 1850, and the Kansas-Nebraska Act. But rather than solve the underlying problem, each just seemed to kick the can down the road, buying some time until the next crisis occurred. Into the fray of this increasingly combustible national discussion about slavery came the brand new Republican Party, and specifically a former Illinois congressman named Abraham Lincoln. His party, while firmly against the expansion of slavery into new territories, made room for a variety of viewpoints on the subject. This posed a significant challenge for Lincoln as an emerging leader within his party. He was allied with the party's moderate wing, which accepted the continuation of slavery in the states where it already existed. But he was also mindful of the views of the more radical members of the party, who advocated for the complete abolition of slavery throughout the country. It was a difficult tightrope to walk. Historian Chris Phillips.
And he is very consistent in his speeches about opposing slavery, saying, I've always hated slavery. I can't remember a time when I didn't hate it, things of that sort. And then, of course, later, his most famous speeches the House divided speech, for example. Many Southerners hear that, and they hear someone who seems radical to them, Democrats in particular. They feel that he is far too extreme. They feel that if he were ever to be elected to a national office, that he would follow through on some of his objections to slavery. And that becomes a real sticking point for an awful lot of people in their support, not only for the Republican Party, but also in their support for Lincoln himself.
And indeed, in 1860, Abraham Lincoln was chosen as the Republican candidate in an unprecedented four-way race for president, along with nominees from the Northern Democratic Party, the Southern Democratic Party, and the Constitutional Union Party. It was a very tight election. And when the dust settled, Lincoln won the Electoral College and thus the presidency, even though he only won just shy of 40% of the popular vote.
For some Americans, they felt that it was rigged. They felt that it wasn't legitimate, and they didn't really accept Lincoln as their president. They also were deeply sensitive about the fact that now the Republican Party has the presidency, and it also has the House of Representatives, that they would now begin to throw their weight around, and that they felt that naturally, given the anti-slavery proclivities and the platform of the Republican Party, they felt that they would begin the process of ending slavery in the nation.
Almost as soon as it became clear that Republican Abraham Lincoln had won the 1860 election, a violent backlash erupted from Democrats, and not just in the southern states that were seceding.
The people who lost the election of 1860 didn't want to deal with the results and sought to thwart the impact of having lost that election.
Mark Lowes is an emeritus professor of history at the University of Cincinnati.
In January, after the election, there were assaults on federal buildings and federal installations all over. This was aimed, of course, at thwarting the impact of losing the election of 1860. And you have attack after attack on U.S. arsenals, on hospitals, on paymaster stations, on forts. Now, when we talk about what was taking place in many communities across the North, were attacks on U.S. recruiters, were attacks on encampments of volunteers. There were a lot of things that were taking place across the North that looked as though, they were organized, coherent, violent actions against federal authorities.
In addition to Democrats resorting to overt violence to oppose the federal government, they also used political means to undermine the war effort, in particular in the Midwest, where they controlled state legislatures. This was especially true after the 1862 midterm elections, held shortly after Lincoln's announcement of the Emancipation Proclamation, which would take effect on January 1st, 1863.
The 1862 election was like a tidal wave.
Historian Chris Phillips.
It energized the opposition. The governors then were hard-pressed to get anything through. And in fact, the Democrats were even more energized to try and openly obstruct anything that these governors tried to do.
The Republican Midwestern governors used a parliamentary procedure known as proroguing to nullify the power of their majority Democratic legislatures by refusing to call the legislature into session. But it was a questionable victory, as it served to radicalize many rank-and-file Democrats in those states.
Proroguing the legislatures of these states in many ways fueled the opposition in ways that they had not been energized prior to it. It almost seemed to me, at least, that the Democrats had some kind of grim satisfaction in knowing that they were in the majority and that they had the ability to continue to make the war effort difficult. And so by proroguing the legislatures, the only thing left to the Democrats to do was violent obstruction. At the local level, we see that playing out with absolute violence in the streets of small towns throughout this region, where Democrats who are disenfranchised have nothing left to lose except to fight it out. And that kind of triggers a civil war within a civil war in many of these small towns and cities throughout the Midwest.
Many Democrats were also enraged by a series of actions taken by the Lincoln administration. The first of these was Lincoln's decision to suspend the writ of habeas corpus and impose martial law, something he said he was compelled to do to stop violent anti-war activities in Maryland and several other northern states. The second major action that Lincoln took, which angered many Democrats, was the Emancipation Proclamation, which freed enslaved people in southern states newly occupied by the Union Army. But it also contained another provision that turned many Democrats against the war, especially in the border states where slavery was still legal.
The more important piece of the Emancipation Proclamation is that it authorizes the federal government to recruit African Americans to join the Union Army.
Eric Jackson is a professor of history and Black studies at Northern Kentucky University.
And so that becomes literally a fear factor, because now you're going to be afraid of what these enslaved African Americans who now have guns could do. The imagery was so palpable to people in the country, it scared them because they didn't know, which brings up so many mythologies. Meaning, because the justification of enslaved people was not just from a Christian standpoint, the argument was this whole weird kind of, they couldn't be educated, they should just be followers and not leaders. Well, all of a sudden, when they have guns, people fear them.
Since the 1790s, the United States had had a law on the books forbidding Black people from serving in the United States Army.
Again, historian Jennifer Weber.
That's because Americans, particularly in the South, were terrified by the prospect of Black men legally carrying arms and knowing how to use them. There was no more terrifying sight, particularly to a Southern American, but also to some people in the North, than looking down the road and seeing Black troops bearing rifles walking down the road toward you, wearing a Union uniform.
The Emancipation Proclamation, of course, we always focus on the impacts that it has on the South. We don't often focus on the dissension and disruption that it creates in the North.
Patrick Lewis is the director of the Filson Historical Society in Louisville and author of For Slavery and Union.
There are still a large number of Democrats did not vote for Abraham Lincoln who are deeply ambivalent about this war in the first place. And now that the war aims seem to have changed fundamentally, really start to oppose and think about how can I, stay out of this war personally, but also maybe actively work to bring it to a close in some sort of resolution that creates a separate independence for the South, right? If they want to go and continue to enslave people, that's fine. Let them do that. I'm tired of paying for this thing.
The next major event that galvanized the Copperheads was the Enrollment Act, which took effect in March of 1863 and created a process for registering able-bodied men to be drafted into the Union Army. Resistance to the draft started almost immediately throughout the northern states, and this resistance took many forms.
It was one thing when they didn't want to fight in a war for Union. Now it's an entirely different matter to be compelled to fight, forced to fight in a war for abolition. And that becomes an absolute non-starter. So there are lots of really creative ways that folks are sort of getting around these drafts. Of course, the most sort of well-known one is hiring substitutes. There are draft insurance pools, so you can buy in with a pool of other men, and if your name gets selected, the insurance pool will pay your substitute fee for you.
While some in the Union states evaded the draft by paying fees or hiring substitutes, others resorted to violence against those who were charged with implementing the draft. Sometimes this took the form of full-scale riots, most infamously in New York City. Again, Jennifer Weber.
We still don't really know how many people were killed in that, but I believe that estimates exceed 1,000 people there, and many of those people would be African Americans. New York is only the most extreme example. There was a very large riot in Boston, a riot in Milwaukee, Wisconsin. There's a county in west central Pennsylvania, Clearfield County. That is so angry and so violent and so combustible that draft agents won't even go into the county because they fear for their own lives. And that's just to write down the names of the people who live in the county. That's not going through an entire draft process. But it becomes very dangerous for the agents of the United States government to do their job because their lives are being threatened, their crops are being burned, their houses are being burned or attacked. Their families are being threatened. It is a really, really frightening time.
If there was one event during 1863 that particularly riled up Copperheads in the North, it was one that involved Ohio Congressman Clement Vallandigham. The importance of Vallandigham in the Copperhead movement and the eventual conspiracy with the Confederates cannot be overstated. He appears in the official records of both the Union and the Confederacy and is mentioned by virtually everyone who has left behind memoirs of this period. And by the middle of 1863, it seemed that every speech he gave just poured gasoline on an already smoldering fire of Democratic discontent. But in one particular speech he made, he appeared, at least to one military leader, to step over the line into something approaching treason.
But I warn also the men in power that there is a vast multitude, a host whom they cannot number, bound together by the strongest and holiest ties to defend, by whatever means the exigencies of the time shall demand, their natural and constitutional rights as free men, at all hazards and to the last extremity.
The general who was in charge of the Department of the Ohio, a man named Ambrose Burnside, had issued an order to the general public saying that anybody who spoke out against the administration or the war effort was subject to be tried by a military tribunal and imprisoned. And that is exactly what happened to Vallandigham. The problem was that Burnside had not told anybody he was going to do this. Lincoln had no idea, and he was really in a pickle here. Even Republicans recognized that this was a pretty drastic violation of Vallandigham's free speech rights. And so in Washington, all these Republicans are wringing their hands about what do we do about this that doesn't completely undermine our general, but also doesn't land this man in prison. And, trust Lincoln to come up with a solution that is both kind of funny and extremely practical. Lincoln's attitude was, okay, you seem to like the Confederates an awful lot. Why don't we send you down there to live with them? And you can just be among your people.
Well, there's a lot of folks in the Midwest who are outraged by that. who saw Vallandigham as exercising not only his rights as a citizen, but his duties as a congressman.
Robert Churchill is a professor of history at the University of Hartford and author of To Shake Their Guns in the Tyrant's Face.
And so that sort of coalesces all of this anger. And you start getting these rural mutual protection societies coming out into the open, holding military parades, giving 3 cheers for Vallandigham as they do it. And it looks like all of this is going to come into a head in June of 1863 when all of the enrollment officers have to go out into the countryside and put everybody's names on a list so that they then will be part of the grand draft lottery that is to come. And when those enrollment officers in this environment go out into the countryside to complete that enrollment, violence does break out. Some of it is violent intimidation, but there are also assassinations. There's 5 enrollment officers who were assassinated in Indiana and Illinois within the space of about 2 weeks.
In the wake of Vallandingham's arrest and exile from the United States, Copperheads began to contemplate progressively more radical actions against the federal government, including conspiring with the Confederacy. And to a large degree, they were overtly fighting to maintain a status quo that protected the role of white people in America. Again, Patrick Lewis.
In the midst of the Civil War, small farmers, middle-class people in towns and cities and rural counties throughout what we now call the Midwest and the Upper South recognized that the war that they had signed up to fight in 1861, a war for the preservation of the Union, was increasingly becoming a war for the emancipation of slaves. And they believed that this violated the very foundations of American democracy, which they believed rested on whiteness. It rested on white possession of the land that they lived on in these states north of the Ohio River, which their grandfathers, maybe even fathers, had fought and won from native peoples. And that was very much the way that they dreamt of the United States as a place that could be a white man's republic. And as the Lincoln administration gradually shifted more and more towards the outright abolition of slavery, lots of people throughout the country, but especially in these states of the Old Northwest, recognized that this was not the republic that they believed they were defending 2 years before. And so as the election of 1864 dawned, they recognized that they had this opportunity to get this tyrant usurper out of office. And while we recognize that they were working with, active Confederate agents who were trying to overthrow the United States, a lot of the people who got swept up in this conspiracy would have told you that unlike the Confederacy, what they were doing was the most patriotic act. They would have claimed that what they were doing was not treason, but in fact was the highest act of pure patriotism that they could, to cut out this cancer that they believed the Republican Party was becoming on the United States.
As the violence against Republicans escalated, and evidence piled up that the Copperheads might be working directly with Confederate agents, Midwestern governors reached out to military leaders to come up with a solution. Together, they decided they needed to fight back by using any means at their disposal, including the recruitment of spies.
He is a classic spy. This is James Bond stuff happening in the 1860s in cities across the Midwest.
That's next time on the Copperhead Conspiracy. The Copperhead Conspiracy is a production of Reckoning, Inc., with funding and scholarly assistance from Ohio Humanities. It was produced and narrated by me, Dan Gettman. Our historical consultant was Dr. Stephen Rockenbach. Voice actors were Alec Voles and Barrett Cooper. Our theme music was composed by Ja'Cory Arthur, with other music licensed from Blue Dot Sessions. Special thanks to Nina Ellis, Louisville Public Media, and to Loretta Williams for editorial guidance. Major support for this series was provided by Archon Construction. Additional support from Jay and Susan Giles, Doreen Juha Sauer, Lopa Mehrotra, and Douglas and Marissa Brown. Many thanks to Jennifer Weber, Mark Laus, Christopher Phillips, Eric Jackson, Patrick Lewis, and Robert Churchill, whose interviews were heard in this episode. Please note that the views expressed by Jennifer Weber do not necessarily reflect the official policy or position of the United States Air Force Academy, the U.S. Air Force, the Department of Defense, or the U.S. government. If you would like to support our nonprofit organization and unlock bonus episodes of this series, you can do so at patreon.com/reckoningradio. Our first bonus episode explains all the key events in American history that led to the Civil War. You can access that and more at patreon.com/reckoningradio. For transcripts, a bibliography, and other content related to this series, please visit our website at copperheadconspiracy.org. That's copperheadconspiracy.org. And if you haven't already done so, please leave a review of this series on whatever platform you use to hear it. It will really help other listeners to find this podcast. Thanks so much for listening. Please join us next time for another episode of the Copperhead Conspiracy.